Okay, super. Well, I've got an easy task today because I'm just introducing Quantropi, represented on the screen by Jay and Michael. Um, in our last IoT Security Foundation Quantum Safe Special Interest Group, we had a demonstration from software engineer Tim Dillon, who did a show and tell basically with some Raspberry Pis. On that, he had loaded the IoT solution, cryptography solution from Quantropi. We actually entered into quite a decent discussion during and certainly post meeting. Steve helped me out with that, and we left a few of those questions open. I had in the back of my mind, I thought, no, it's much better here to bring in Quantropi, bring in the owners of this technology and this IP. So I invited Jay and Michael to come on board, present to the IoT Security Foundation group today, and then we can share that down the normal channels that Chris provides for us using the usual media routes. So I think at this point, I will hand over to Quantropi. They can introduce themselves and they can introduce their business, and hopefully they've got a good story to tell you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Richard. Great to meet everybody. My name is Jay Toth. I run sales and business development for Quantropi. I'm going to tag team our discussion today with Mike Redding, who is our CTO. He'll introduce himself in just a minute. I've been with Quantropi for over 3 years now, spent the majority of my career at Microsoft and kind of got hooked on, the cybersecurity space in various roles at Microsoft because if my customers were involved in a cyber incident, which happened quite a bit, and if Microsoft was, leading the incident response, which also happened quite a bit, I kind of was read in on, what was going on from an incident response perspective with cyber breaches. So that's kind of what really got, me interested to dive deep down the rabbit hole in this space. Looking forward to chatting with you guys today. I encourage everyone to stop and pause and ask us questions if you have them. Either feel free to just come off mute or put them in the chat, and we'll address them as best we can. And I'll let Mike do a quick introduction here before we get going.
Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Redding, and I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Quantropi. And so, in that respect, I'm responsible for working with our research team on core IP development, and then after that, turn that into commercially available uh, products. And everything we'll talk to you today about is fully available to you. And we'll highlight some of the form factors and some of the ways that we're delivering it, but there's plenty more. So again, as Jay said, we're wide open to questions. And prior to joining Quantropi, I spent almost 30 years at the global services firm Accenture, always in the role of bringing emerging technologies to Accenture's enterprise and government clients around the world. And for a while, headed up Accenture's technology labs, including cybersecurity labs in Washington and Tel Aviv, and also spearheaded Accenture's equity investments in startups to try to have some skin in the game around emerging technology, and along the way did some investments in IoT, cybersecurity, and quantum. So very excited to be here today and to share what we can with us with this group.
Fantastic. So we're going to cover a bit of background first. I think, I'm going to go through this fairly quickly because I'm guessing most of you guys are extremely well versed in this space. But just to kind of, I think, provide some context before we get into the discussion, we'll zip through some background here for a couple of slides. Just quick, bullet on Quantropi. We were founded in 2018 out of Ottawa, Canada. Our two co-founders, one was in banking at RBC Canada, is responsible for fundraising and finance, and the other is really where the majority of our IP gets generated with our chief scientist, Dr. Randy Kwong. He is a quantum physicist by trade, grew up in the research community at, Bell Labs and Nortel Networks, and really has been looking at this space for, well over a decade now. And part of what I would say makes us a little bit different is, his background as a quantum physicist and the, notion that he had way back from, day one of the company to use the principles of quantum physics to fight the threat from quantum on, modern day encryption. So he likes to say fighting quantum with quantum. We've got a number of patents around our platform, which we'll talk about, rigorously published academically. We're up to, I think, 30 or more now, scientific publications, academic partnerships. But that's just a little bit about the company. So, like I said, I think everybody here is probably very well versed in this. We started doing these presentations 5 years ago, and most people didn't even understand what a quantum computer was, much less the threat that it would have on modern or current encryption technology. But the scope of what is vulnerable from a quantum computer, and now really it's, as we always envisioned, AI plus quantum in these attacks, is everything from modern PKI to digital signatures on DocuSign documents, every financial transaction, including almost many of the transactions that happen in the IoT space. And we'll talk about some specific challenges that exist in that space, due to complexities of implementation, as well as constraints from a resource perspective on those devices. And this is just a quick graphic to kind of illustrate the acceleration, that's happened. This threat has been understood all the way back to 1994, going back to Peter Shor and Shor's algorithm. But in 1994, we had 50 to 85 years before we got to this Q day when encryption could be compromised. And so while the threat was understood, this wasn't anywhere close to the top of the radar for anyone at that time. NIST kicked off PQC submissions to get new algorithms selected over a decade now, because that process actually started in 2016. And even in 2016, this was viewed widely as a 2030s problem, if not a 2040s problem. And so we still had this 20 to 40 year time window to prepare. The acceleration really has built significant momentum in, I would say, the last 2 to 3 years. And as early as 2024, McKinsey did a quantitative analysis on the innovation, specifically in the quantum space, error correction on qubits, numbers of qubits required to do compromises. And way back in 2024, at this point, they said, yeah, the way early side is 2027 on this window, but it's much more likely still in that 2030s, 2035 time period. But that was quickly followed by a Gartner assessment in 2025 that said, we've now got 4 years. It was followed by IonQ in 2025 publishing their hardware roadmap, where they said, look, in 2029 we're going to have 8,000 logical qubits in the system, and in 2030 we're going to have 80,000 logical qubits, which is the 8,000 is double the number needed to compromise RSA 2048. And then the most recent news we don't have on here, but I saw some references to it in the chat already. It was pretty significant when both Google and Cloudflare less than 30 days ago said, we're advancing our timetable to 2029 to be quantum safe. And the Google announcement came out first and was conspicuously absent of any reason why they moved their time frame up so significantly. But that reason came 5 days later when they published a paper on attacking Bitcoin, showing they could do it with a 20 times more efficiency, 20 times less number of qubits in an attack, and do a Bitcoin compromise in 9 minutes with 500,000 qubits. And they optimized on the 9-minute time frame, which is why they needed 500,000. The following day, a paper came out of Caltech that said if we don't optimize on time but optimize on number of qubits, and they did some things there a little bit differently in terms of the type of quantum system they were using. But in less than 2 weeks, they could compromise a transaction with under 10,000 qubits. So the bottom line is the time frame has shrunk considerably. This has really started to advance into the current priority list for a number of companies that are leading the way, and that acceleration is only going to continue. Our thinking from a Quantropi perspective, we've been saying all along that this is a definitely before the end of the decade event that's likely to occur. And we actually lean towards, the 2027 to 2028 timeframe more so even than the 2029 one. But whether it's 2027 or 2029, the message is clear that this upgrade has to happen now.
So Jay, the other 2 points I'd make on that, one is that because I saw the comment about Meta, but the Google and Cal Poly work was enhanced with AI, right? So it was AI that led them into a new formulation so therefore that's the synergy that we're starting to see, and we'll see it come up again in a few minutes, that AI is enhancing the research into how to compromise and how to configure quantum systems to do this kind of attack. And then number two, the national security brief came out for the US, and they for the first time elevated the quantum threat to be on par and equal to the AI threat to national security. And so it is no longer a someday thing. They've now said it is an equal threat. And we've seen a lot of, hype, especially around Mythos from Anthropic, about how devastating AI may be on cybersecurity in general. And the US government now has a formal opinion that quantum is equally dangerous. So all those things create, just keep quadruple down on the urgency of this whole transition.
So, right, the good news in all of this story, right, is that we've had new standards since 2024. Most people still don't realize that. And multiple standards that exist and more that are coming. And just a couple quick comments on this. The more that are coming part, I think, is also, kind of lost in the message. I think NIST realizes and recognizes these threat vectors. They realize that they've got a, lack of diversity in the mathematics behind these algorithms, because MLChem and DSA are both based on, lattice. And there are some attacks on lattice that we'll talk about that are worth monitoring as they develop. And so all the new submissions and all the new algorithms that are, now going under review by NIST, which is still going to be a years long process. They specifically in digital signature said, don't submit any more lattice stuff. We want to pick, a different mathematical foundation. And so the good news is there are standards that customers can implement, and they're widely available. But we'll talk about some of the challenges that poses from an IoT scenario here. The other quick comment on this is that from a regulatory perspective, while CRA doesn't specifically say you need to implement post-quantum, it does say you need to implement state-of-the-art for your cryptographic functions. And so with new standards available going on almost 2 years now, that is considered state-of-the-art. And so from that perspective, CRA basically does say you need to implement PQC because that's state-of-the-art. It does call out crypto agility specifically, and why you can have crypto agile systems that are using legacy algorithms, and almost nobody implemented that way. And most folks are looking to implement in a crypto agile manner when they do this PQC upgrade. And so effectively, without saying you need to implement PQC, CRA says you need to implement PQC. All right, so let's shift to the IoT world now, The challenge that exists, and this is, definitely more of a concern with brownfield implementations that exist already, is that new algorithms have larger key sizes, more memory, and longer cycle times. And for, IoT chips that are on the, I would say, midpoint to upper end of the spectrum, largely you're not going to see too much of a problem unless you've got unique performance constraints. But on the bottom end of the spectrum, you will definitely see some challenges depending on what your implementation looks like. And so here's some metrics and some testing just to give you guys some figures around that. If you just look at public key and signature size numbers overall, you can see on the left, if you're using ECDSA or RSA 2048, you've got fairly small keys. They're pretty manageable even on a resource constrained IoT device. But if you look at the new PQC standards, the public key size for LMS and XMSS are fairly small still, even smaller than classic. but those are stateful implementations. And so you've got some extra work there to do to make sure your security is buttoned up. If you don't want to do a stateful implementation, then you're talking about something that's MLDSA, 3 different security levels. And this is where the numbers really start to get significant from a key size comparison perspective, right? You're talking, multiples of times order of magnitude larger for that, key size comparison. And as you can imagine, this is going to transition over to memory utilization as well, right? So you can look at, ECDSA or RSA, you're talking about, right, 8 to 20, right, K of memory on your device. But if you want to implement, right, a PKI transaction using MLChem and MLDSA, and you're going to do it at security level 5, which is all the way to the right, you need 123 K of memory on your device. And that's free memory to just do this transaction, right? Now, we're talking about, right, software implementations. There are also now a number of hardware choices that are available and coming available on the market, but those will be, prevalent as a consideration in a new implementation. But if you want to do a legacy upgrade, right, you're not going to rip and replace the hardware most likely from that perspective. So you're going to need something that's software based. And then here's some just milliseconds on performance time, right? To give you a benchmark, you're probably talking about, again, an order of magnitude less cycle time, faster performance with classic security versus what you're going to get for digital signature and key exchange. We've tested this on, a number of different, ARM devices from a number of different manufacturers. And while the numbers may vary a little bit, the message is still very consistent that, right, it's order of magnitude difference. And then you can see here when we go from, right, an ARM M7 to an ARM M4, we've got less memory. So much so that on a typical Cortex ARM M4 chip, you cannot even run MLChem or MLDSA at security level 5 because you don't have enough memory available in the system to do it. So that kind of brings us to what really should you be thinking about when you're trying to plan your PQC upgrade or migration in an IoT context, right? The first one obviously is what resources do you have that are available? If you fall into the lucky bucket where you've got plenty of resources on your device and you don't have a performance scenario that is constrained, right, by the larger key sizes and slower cycle times, then fantastic, right? If you're on the borderline or you don't have enough resources, then you're going to need to come up with some kind of an alternative plan. And part of that alternative plan can be looking at the security level, right? There are 3 security levels you can pick from when you do your PQC implementation. But I would also say it's interesting that some countries, in addition to deprecating classic security algorithms, have already announced dates, Australia specifically, where they've deprecated the level 1 PQC algorithm implementations as well, because they don't believe for a number of years they're going to be, quantum safe in the future. So it's possible you could look at a different security level, but you kind of have to weigh that decision carefully with, right, the progress and keep up on the timelines when even the lower security levels are being deprecated in some areas. Third is your functional scenario. So PKI is fantastic, but you have other options aside from PKI depending on your functional scenario. Specifically, if you control both endpoints in your transaction because it's your client application running in the IoT environment and it's your endpoint on the server, you could choose to do what we call, right, application level encryption on the data payload. And yes, you're still going to encrypt transport on TLS, but if you've already encrypted the data inside using, right, AES 256, or we have a novel algorithm Mike will talk about that is even stronger than AES 256, you've kind of got a different security mechanism where you're not solely dependent on the PKI. And so if you've got a functional scenario where you control both endpoints and you've also got a device that is not capable of migrating to PQC, right? Again, this becomes an interesting option for you to consider. And we used to always talk about timeline, but I've kept this, bullet on here because timeline really is not a consideration in our opinion any longer. It's likely that we're going to, right, hit this 2028, 2029 timeline, prior to even new additional algorithms being standardized by NIST, because there are some additional algorithms that are under review. They've got better performance characteristics than what I just showed, but they're not vetted yet. And you probably don't have the time to wait for those, to be vetted, because it's still, right, we're still talking about years before, right, that next set is going to go through the approval process. And that brings us to the last point, something that we'll talk about today that's a differentiator in our platform, which is just not other novel algorithms. So in addition to supporting all of the NIST PQC standards, our platform does include novel alternatives that are Quantropi IP. They, right, were conceived primarily by our chief science officer that I talked about in our opening slide. And they've got a set of performance characteristics that basically mimic the classic algorithms that are widely used today. We are not an order of magnitude higher in key size or cycle time or memory, and can run on devices as small as Cortex ARM M0 chips. So I would be kind of remiss if I also did not talk about this other threat vector, which has gone unnoticed, but that's also starting to change. Weak number generation is also a key ingredient in cryptography. And if you have a weak number that you're using as the foundation for your cryptographic function, you're also going to very likely have a weak key. This has been a concern for a while, but it is also now getting heightened by specifically AI and machine learning, because that's the attack against weak number generation. And if I can compromise your mechanism for generating the randomness you use in your system, I can compromise your cryptographic keys. There's a number of published studies that we're referencing here, and research work that has been done. To put it into context, in the AES 256 world, if you don't have at least 85% of the bits in your AES 256 key, which is 220 bits, that are considered to be highly random or strong entropy, you can almost immediately compromise that key with a brute force guessing attack. And I don't even need a quantum system to do it. I can do it with a high performance computing system, let alone some of the capabilities we have now today. And so, right, weak number generation and your source of entropy is critically important. And this has been even highlighted by NIST. And again, we'll distribute the slides for you guys. You can follow some of the links that we have in here. But NIST even highlighted this on a webcast that they hosted, where they talked about this attack, right, on the underpinnings of Lattice, which is called learning with errors. And it's an AI attack, and it makes use of weak random as well. So much so that if you have, right, weak random in your system, it's even more critical on the PQC side, because, right, bigger PQC keys require more random. You can see you've got, right, NIST level 4 security, your key exchange mechanism needs 768 bits of entropy. That's 3 times the amount you need for AES 256 key generation. And so if you've got a weak entropy component of your system and you migrate to PQC, you may have an even bigger vulnerability than you did before, because of the role that this plays. This is also something that, right, NIST has, I would say, now formally highlighted, because as of January of 2026, if you are going to go through the process to get a FIPS 140-3 certificate on your the cryptography in your system or your application, they've added a new requirement. That new requirement is called, right, an ESV, an entropy source validation report. And the entropy source validation report essentially requires you to use a NIST 890B source of entropy in your solution that has been, right, validated as providing a strong entropy foundation for the cryptography. So it's the first time ever that NIST has linked the FIPS certification to the entropy certification and made it a requirement. Okay. That's kind of the backdrop. Happy to take questions now if you guys have them. Otherwise, I'd recommend let's move straight into Mike's segment, where we talk about the platform and solutions that we've built on top of the platform.
Well, we'll just give it a second. Any questions? And see anything pop up in comments, but any live questions before we jump? Go ahead. Okay. Well, you can always pop them in chat. We're monitoring it. Okay. So, what are, we doing about this? And I will try to talk more about the capability set. And this is not intended to be a sales pitch, but more educational. So bear with us on that. So when, because Jay just kind of highlighted it, I'll come back to the ground principle of that there are three fundamental building blocks of complete cryptographic security. And it's kind of all three phases, if you would, which is the asymmetric encryption, which Jay just spent a bunch of time um, talking about, but that's the both the initial verification of identity, which is digital signature, and the exchange of the session key using a key exchange mechanism. And so those are the two components under asymmetric, and as maybe beaten to death, those are the ones that are immediately vulnerable to a quantum attack. The second piece is once you've established trust and established a shared secret, is symmetric encryption. And right now, the gold standard here is AES 256. AES 128 is really the minimum. Um, and this one is considered, again, a long off problem. Yeah, there's Grover's algorithm that can weaken it, but it's this one again is on that, 20, 30 years before we have to sweat it, timeline. Um, Again, we would say, well, if you're really looking at some of the cutting edge research, maybe not. And again, our friend AI factors into it. There was a interesting thought piece put out a little over a year ago by Whitfield Diffie, the inventor of Diffie-Hellman and one of the world's leading experts and father figures when it comes to asymmetric encryption. He co-authored a paper with IBM Research where they looked at AI as an accelerant on the attacks on AES, and they actually pinned current symmetric methods to having maybe a decade left. So we can't forget about that one. But for now, again, when there's so much hardware acceleration, there's so much de facto that most people will always use AES for the symmetric piece of the pie. But as Jay maybe alluded to, we do offer a novel algorithm in this space that can take a longer key size because AES is topped out at 256 bit. We can go up to a whopping 32,000 bit symmetric key, and our default is a 1024 bit key with benchmarks by like Siemens, who did it for their industrial control systems, where they saw it running 10 to 12 times faster than AES 256. But as Jay mentioned, that is really, you know, um, right now we're going to be adopted in very limited scenarios where you've got control of both ends of the pipe and have this absolute requirement for ultra security, but ultra performance. And so that's a very narrow slice. So we're not going to spend a lot of time, but if anyone's really interested in symmetric encryption, we can always follow up and talk about that. And then last but not least, what Jay just hit on, which is, what's the point of a strong lock if you have a weak key? And so the ability to generate quantum random numbers and have them available for all cryptographic functions anywhere in the network is absolutely critical. And so if all three are working at a quantum safe level, the system is quantum safe. And we think that, and we package that all under our QiSpace product umbrella. So that's how we make this available. We want it to kind of be the one-stop shop and you can use these pieces independently, and that's great. If you have other sources of random numbers, if you're happy with AES 256, super. The idea is mix and match, so you get the security capabilities your embedded application requires. Okay, Jay? Okay. And so when we think about post-quantum cryptography for IoT, we think about it kind of this, again, we make these broad statements, every device, every application, every network, but to some degree, that's the grand challenge of IoT because uh, whether it's hundreds of millions or billions, the number of embedded devices in the universe, or our world, I guess that's a human-centric universe, is, outnumbers people. In fact, I think the average household has at least, and this is an older stat now, so I bet it's even worse or better or more, however you want, whatever adjective you want to give it, 17 devices per person that have some intelligence. And that becomes a gigantic threat vector. And that's why, for example, both European and US governments have created this PQC mandate. And actually starting in 2027, for example, nothing in the US can be procured by the US government if it isn't PQC. So we got a call from a coffee manufacturer, coffee machine manufacturer, because Uncle Sam drinks a lot of coffee. And those devices are online for remote diagnostics purposes because they're large machines going into cafeterias at installations, and because they have a brain, they are a threat vector, and so they have to be cryptographically hardened. So you need quantum safe coffee. Who knew, right? And so that's the scope of this, and you can't, as Jay said, go around and replace every smart chip everywhere with a brand new one with more resources. So, and the way you talk to them sometimes is 5G networks, sometimes is old school control networks, which is why, Siemens was taking a hard look at this because they've got old school wireline protocols they've got to harden, and which again is non-trivial. So that's why this is a big topic, almost infinite. And we kind of break it down to how do we secure the device, where we think about secure boot and code signing and over-the-air firmware. In fact, NSA wants the US, that's the first quantum safe scenario. They want end-to-end software security because they don't want a SolarWinds type, catastrophe where so many systems get compromised just through bad software updates or maliciously modified software. So secure boot is like a number one scenario, at least from the US government perspective. Then we also want to think about application security, all the data, because again, a lot of IoT is cheap and cheerful and is pumping out, streaming data, sets. How do we protect those? And I think it sounds like from what Richard said, you guys had a previous, had Tim show you, I suspect it was the MQTT messaging where they've been able to cryptographically harden it. And then last but not least, the network itself, the TLS communications, how do you secure those so that you can be application or device independent? So again, network security, device security, application security, these are all, as Jay said, pick where you've got interest and control and how do you bring PQC to life? That's the goal. All right, Jay, if you go to the next one. So Jay mentioned this, and where you've got a problem, namely you don't have the time or the resources, not human time, but latency in your application for the handshake, for the processing. You don't have the memory and you don't have the timeline to wait for whatever comes out of NIST and the global process next to come up with better performance. Quantropi does offer a set of novel digital signature and key exchange mechanism. And importantly, as Jay said, you can see from the stats here, at NIST level 5, MLDSA needed 123K. We need 11, right? And they were talking, almost half a second for sign and verify. We're looking at 11 milliseconds. And signing in particular is really important when you think about digital signature on data streams from sensor networks because you want to know that it's authentic data. So you just want to cryptographically sign it. Well, if it takes you half a second to sign every, 4 bytes of tire pressure on your car for your tire monitor, that's not exactly the greatest for performance, especially when it comes to real-time monitoring of vehicle safety. And so that's what we offer. And again, we don't want to make it a sales pitch, but again, it's if you have these extreme requirements, you may consider these novel algorithms. And importantly, this is not some black art. We've done a whole bunch of academic publication because nobody likes secret cryptography because the assumption, of course, is that it's somehow compromised. So everything about our algorithms is okay, I see the question from Mohit, and that's a great question. The I lost my third train of thought. I saw the question and I lost my train of
I'll
thought.
look it up if you want to keep going. I'll go to
Yeah.
the source and see which clock cycle we tested it
Yeah.
on.
I want to say it was a Cortex M7 is my guess, but you can double
Yeah,
check
it's
it.
either M7 or M4, I
Oh,
think.
so the question was
Yeah,
for signing performance with 11 milliseconds, 40 seconds, milliseconds to sign verify, what's the clock frequency considered? And I think it was a Cortex M7. But that's the right uh, question to ask. And actually, for formal benchmarking, most people actually talk about not time, but number of CPU cycles, because then you can do cycles times time, and then it becomes more of a um, it's more transitive in order to be able to map it into which specific processor you're using in terms of time. So it's more actual CPU cycles. And that's the way we, like in academic papers or other benchmarks, we usually express it. But this was to compare it to that specific benchmark Jay had earlier, where we did it in time for that particular paper. So that's why this one example is in time. But a more universal thing is how many clock cycles. So that's the right question to ask. Um, okay, then Jay, why don't we keep going?
I'll look at the answer, put it in the chat.
Yeah. So importantly, what we deliver in our package is number one, FIPS compliant cryptographic libraries, and in fact, we're in the certification process now. We dragged our feet a little bit to wait to the till we were sure that the NIST algorithms were stable, and they seem to be. And so we're going through formal certification now. So we think that or what I see Martin's question. We'll come back to that in a second. So that's going through certification now. So that's the exciting part, and we think that that's again very important for regulated industries. Um, Second, um, our algorithm, we of course, our library of course supports the full NIST approved. Again, giving you that chance for one-stop shop. The novel algorithms and the long question there. But I'll come back. So our novel algorithms, right? So if you're really constrained and you can't use the novel algorithms, but a lot of time, or don't lose get my words mixed up, the standard algorithms. But again, I think this is an edge use case. We're always going to tell you if you can use the standard algorithm because they are the most vetted, they are standardized, they are part of a regulated framework. But interestingly, EU guidance, going back to CRA, um, doesn't specify which algorithms. In fact, uh, US has come down very strongly. NSA has come down very strongly on only use the new NIST algorithms, full stop. We're so confident in them. Don't use anything else. Europe, especially BSI, French ANSI, have come out and said, actually, we would prefer hybrids. We'd actually like to see you use a classic, which we know and love, with one of these new algorithms in order to make sure you have defense in depth, you have heterogeneous crypto systems. So an attacker has to break two complete crypto systems. Now that adds two keys together, so therefore it's longer, even longer key length, adds processing together, even longer processing times, but they're hedging their bets. And interestingly, for example, they don't specify what that second algorithm is. And in fact, France has said they won't consider any algorithms quantum safe explicitly by themselves, standalone till the 2030s. They want the test of time. So as always in cryptography, everyone is always wants to move slowly. Um, and that's why we think it's important that, again, you understand your operating environment, your target regulatory schemes, the guidance for the countries or the government where your products are going to be operating so that you adopt to the conditions that make the most sense for your operations. Um, okay. Uh, let's go back and look at the questions because they're popping up and we don't want to run past them. Uh, okay.
Mike, I can chime in on a couple of these and then
Yeah, please.
you can as well. So the first thing to understand is we are very clear in all of our right customer conversations and interactions, right? If you can implement the standard, you should. That's why the standard exists. It has been vetted more than, right, anything, right, else that's available. And it's the reason that it exists as a standard. So that's the first, right? That's the first message, full stop. The question that we find, coming up more and more from customers is, what if I can't run it? Because my resource constrained IoT device literally does not have the memory to run it, right? And you can see what those thresholds look like. Then you've got a different decision to make. You either need to rip and replace your entire system and probably implement something that's got hardware acceleration, which in some cases is a consideration, but not a consideration in all cases. Then you've got to make a decision if that's not viable, right? Do you leave classic security? And that could be, right, the answer that customers go with. You can also choose, right, a different path and maybe use the payment option where you're not then dependent on the security of the transport. But if you don't control both ends of the transaction, that may be problematic, or it may be problematic for other reasons. And so all we're saying is, for some customers, right, this is an option that they may find makes the most sense for them. And right, it's the reason why we've published as much as we have around the mathematics and the proofs behind the novel algorithms that we've presented. And over, it's been like 7 years now, I think, probably six years at least. We've found weaknesses, and we've published information about weaknesses and things that we've had to harden in our own algorithms, and haven't obscured anything that's come out as we've kind of traveled down this path. And so we've done everything we can to be public and open about it. We give the customers the guidance that I've talked about, and it's not a choice that's for everyone, but it may be a choice for some people. And I think for the longest time, I'll say, the thought process was, well, by the time we actually get to a quantum threat that's real, we'll have additional choices from NIST. And I'll tell you that unless they somehow speed up their process a whole lot faster than what they've done before, we believe at least it's likely that that day will come before we have a new set of algorithms from NIST that have better performance, that are more reasonable to implement on certain IoT systems. So I guess, Martin, happy to chat more. That's the best way that I can, address, the question that you've posed there. And Mike, I don't know if you have any comments.
No, I think that's dead on. I don't want to over-index on novel, and we'll keep going in a second. But because novel, whether you choose to adopt it or not, because you need to or don't, it reinforces crypto agility, which is getting out of the mindset of, oh, I'm sorted. I have the new algorithm done. We're out of that era, and things are going to change. Things are going to break, and can you dynamically adjust your cryptographic base? And I'll talk about in a few slides where we've done some work, because some of the things that people use a lot in embedded systems were effectively hard coded to protect people from making cryptographic mistakes. A lot of systems are effectively hard coded to the legacy classic standards, and now have to be refactored, in some cases quite dramatically, to even allow you to change the algorithms beyond a certain closed set. And that's a problem going forward from an architectural perspective. There's a question from David, and I'll shorten it. He did a good example, good long question, but he's an OEM and hasn't been paying for cryptography before. And is it an option to wait for libraries implementation that he uses to be upgraded and then just migrate to a new version, and or wait for newer MPUs in the same families that come with hardware acceleration? And the answer is, oops, Jay, you just went on the presentation.
I got it.
Did you need to do
I'm
it?
opening the benchmark to get the other answer. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry, all right. The uh, time is the magic question there. Because yes, every vendor on the planet is in some scurry to, over some product roadmap to upgrade both hardware and software. And so depending on your supply chain of hardware and software and their timelines, if they get there before you are worried about it, becoming a threat vector. If they can deliver to you and you can do that upgrade, then you can, wait for that and inherit it from their good work. And so you don't have to do something on your own. Again, if it's all black box to you, wait till the black box. If I'm using Windows, I'm going to wait till Microsoft comes up with Windows 11. I'm not going to go make Windows Mike and make my own version of Windows. I get that. But then the risk just becomes if you're doing a bare metal and you've got complete software stack, then somewhere along the way you're going to have to figure it. Or if you have a fleet of 10 million devices already in the field and you can't go run around and pull chips and they have another 5 or 10 year life cycle, what are you going to do? So that's why everyone has to look at, like Jay threw the questions out there. What's your timeline? What's your surface? What's your level of control? And what's your supply chain look like? And that's why this is a non-trivial exercise to kind of map this out. We're just letting you know one of the, through this, what we've made available if it supports your needs. Okay.
The
Let's,
other David, the other part of your question you asked about was what's widely available from the open source community, right? And I think over time, more may become available. But one of the unique challenges in the IoT space is the libraries are compiled somewhat specifically for the target hardware environment. We've even seen differences, right, in stuff that we've done where we've got, right, the same Cortex ARM chip, whether it's an M4 or an M7. One of them is Renesas, one of them is from ST Micro, and the libraries are not compatible, and we've had to make tweaks and differences. And so you've kind of got this, perfect storm of, what's the architecture of the chip, M0, M4, M7, M33, M whatever. Who is it from? Which MCU manufacturer? And then if you're not doing bare metal, even the RTOS can have some differences. And so one of the things we do for customers is support all of that, right? We compile across, and make sure our libraries are compatible for the exact customer target hardware environment, including the RTOS, the manufacturer, and the chip architecture. And I think this is going to be a big barrier in the open source community because there are literally hundreds of variations, if not thousands of variations that are technically right possible. Now, some stuff may be fairly compatible, but you don't know until you try it. And so that's definitely another challenge. But Mike, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. Why don't we
yeah,
let's
let's motor on. Click through.
Yep.
Okay. And so, so we've focused so far really on, on the asymmetric algorithm, which is fantastic. But the great news is we also offer a software-based random number generator, and we're going through the 90B certification right now because, as Jay pointed out, going forward, new FIPS certificates will all require a certified source of randomness. And Jay sent out a link to everyone on this call. We're giving a talk tomorrow with ST Micro where we're going to focus just on this topic. And this uses a well-known pattern of where the CPU jitter or timing variances of memory, disk access, processing of specific transactions on the CPU, those variations in timing are used as the hardware source of noise. Um, and then we put it through a variation of our symmetric algorithm, which is called a quantum permutation pad. Think of it as like a quantum equivalent of a one-time pad. And that results in a stream of high entropy random numbers that can be used as input to your cryptographic primitives. And because this is a software um, implementation, it can run across, whole families and heterogeneous environments without having to write, your firmware to adopt to each individual device's hardware RNG or lack of hardware RNG, if it doesn't have one. And so, but again, the question will be is if you are running on an MCU or MPU, it has a hardware RNG, and especially newer generation like Cortex M33 almost always do. If it has a FIPS certified source and it's fast and it's giving you sufficient entropy, you're gold. If you're working on an M4 or an M0, an older generation M7 that doesn't have RNG on it, then this gives you an option to upgrade your this gives you an option as to where to get your entropy. So the question Martin just brought up is how does secure differ from putting the raw entropy input into AES? It is the raw entropy input. That's the important point. Because you need a raw entropy. And as you saw earlier, there was a study that said if you do AES 256 and you don't have 220 bits of strong entropy, an attacker can shred your and recover your secret. And so that's where this becomes the raw entropy that you feed into it. And things like there's a bunch of papers lately about like dev random that you get from the OS isn't strong enough to meet the new cryptographic standards. And so that's where you need, again, to consider a new source, whether hardware from the chip or a software like this algorithm. Either way, you've got to ask yourself the question, where am I getting a 90B certified source of entropy to feed into any cryptographic function? Because if I don't have that, I'm cryptographically weak, even if I go to new PQC. So to bring it to life, an example where we're trying to make this easy for people to adopt, we've partnered with ST Micro. So if you're in the ST Micro community, right there in CubeMX, there's a Quantropi tab, and you can, for free, download the base version, which is the NIST PQCs right there, and get that basic, libraries right in. And so we think that's going to cover a lot of folks. But if you want, you can then upgrade through a licensing with us to some of the higher order functions, which I'm about to talk about in a second. But we support M0, M4, M33, M7, A7. We also, not just in this slide, talks about ST Micro. In fact, Jay, go to the next one, because I think I even have to see, they can even see there the Quantropi tab right there in CubeMX. That's because that's our deepest partnership. But we do also support Renesas, Microchip, Silicon Labs, Nordics, Raspberry Pi, both, of course, embedded Linux across a number of platforms, Zephyr, FreeRTOS, the list goes on. But as Jay said, usually if a customer comes in with a chip or a target we haven't supported in the past, as long as there's a tool chain, our benchmark right now is we can turn around a verified version of our SDK in about 48 hours. And so, okay. So the question Martin brought back up, so he thinks I missed the point, so let's review it. The point is that pour entropy from hardware and feed it through a magic function, make it stronger. AES 256 can provide such a mixing function, but which will look the same statistically. But those are deterministic functions. And the whole point of a 90B compliant hardware source is to be non-deterministic, because 90A covers deterministic sources. 90B comes from hardware. And the fact that we're using our quantum permutation pad as a conditioning algorithm is actually supported in the 90B specification from NIST. So you can think of it as the algorithm we're using as that conditioning or whitening function, and that's supported by the 90B. But in the end, the source of entropy has to be the true hardware, and that's what this is. So, okay, let's go on, Jay.
Mike, let's talk about secure boot and secure networking, because
Yeah,
one of the other, right? This also goes to David's question, I think, around the open source community, right?
sure.
If you go out today and try to find an open source implementation of MCU boot, which is the most commonly used open source bootloader, it doesn't exist, or at least we haven't seen that it exists.
Right. And Jay just said in a nutshell. So MCU boot doesn't yet have a open source PQC integration. So we've done that work. And that's where I mentioned earlier, it was non-trivial to go through and figure out where they had hard coded all of the assumptions around cryptography in order to, unwind that and make it crypto agile so that it can accept MLChem and MLDSA, everything from the image signing tool all the way through to the bootloader. And actually, our newest version not only does the bootloader in common memory, but also now in the TrustZone. So for modern architectures, we're using TrustZone. It was quite an interesting, the difference between secure boot and bootloader in common memory versus TrustZone. And so we offer both of those. And I'm sure over the fullness of time, the open source community will do the heavy lifting and will catch up on that. And this will become all open source. But for the moment, we did that heavy lift and make that available. So for folks that are MCU boot customers and want, again, an accelerated timeline to getting to that full quantum software supply chain lifecycle, that's available from us now. But if you have the time and the community moves forward, like they don't no doubt will, then this will become again open source in the fullness of time. And then
And
click Jay.
I, yeah, and the
I'm trying to be
last
respectful of
point
time,
to
Jim.
make here is,
Oh,
on our implementation, right? Right, when you take our MCU boot solution, you get to pick what implementation you want from an algorithm perspective, right? You can use NIST PQC, you can use novel, you can use hybrid, right? All those options are right packaged up. And so that's, the customer choice that we try to provide on all the different solutions Mike's going to talk about.
right. And then the other variation on that theme is embed TLS. Again, there was quite a bit of lifting to get a version of embed TLS that would, again, you run with MLDSA and MLChem along with our novel algorithms. And of course, using our strong entropy for key generation and for symmetric keys. And so that's now available. And the great news is you can put upgraded embed TLS on your device, and now you can talk to any cloud service or any endpoint running TLS 1.3 that has also been upgraded through OpenSSL 3.x. Usually it's 3.3 or 3.2 and higher, where they've adopted PQC. So if you only control the device, but you're talking to any number of emerging services like Cloudflare for your backhaul of your data, if they've upgraded to PQC and you upgrade your device, now you've just protected all of that communications. And we think that that's going to be, as the cloud folks move first to kind of create, not all of them have done it yet, but have they create PQC TLS endpoints, you upgrade your device, now you've just hardened your communications. And again, over the fullness of time, we expect this will be open source. But for now, we've done the early work to get it available to those that have an urgent demand for it. Okay, Jay? And then Jay mentioned this earlier, but if you control both ends of the application, but you may use common infrastructure, this particular use case was using Azure IoT Hub for messaging, for example, for sensing data. There, if you control the application, you can do things like give it a post-quantum signature at the data field level, and then you don't care that the transport is compromised because in that case, it's obviously data that you don't mind if someone reads it, but you don't want anyone to hack it or deepfake it. And then you can do this at the application layer where you sign it at the time of generation and then verify it in your business logic and ignore the transport and assume it's an untrustworthy transport, but you've protected the data at the signature level or using something like our symmetric encryption pattern, whether it's AES or our quantum algorithm. The point being that you can protect it at the application layer if you've got both ends. And so again, trying to show you the versatility that this isn't a one trick pony or a one implementation or architecture pattern, but rather a toolbox that you can slot into however your application or your device is working.
Not too bad. We only went a couple minutes over. Um, uh, Happy to take more questions now if anybody has them, and wants to stick around for a couple more minutes. We're happy to do additional Q&A.
It's Trevor here. Have you done a hardening exercise on your library modules? I mean, if you take the standard PQC algorithms, there's a number of them have been published, but there's quite a lot of research papers on the fact that they haven't been hardened. So they tend to have to be tuned to the particular processor architecture. Is that something that you do as a service?
It's an interest. You brought up a couple of different dimensions there, which are all very important. We definitely look at it from a software, kind of hardware agnostic point of view, where we try to look at, are there specific well-known side channel or timing attacks that we can try to cover in how we implement the software. But there's also quite a bit where it can get into the specific of the processor architecture itself, and for example, the choice to run inside TrustZone versus not, where again, if you have a trust zone, then that gives you more options than if you don't have a trust zone. And so that's something we can work with a customer or partner on to look at more closely to say, what's your target environment and have we done enough, or is there more we can do to specifically try to protect it? Because, and again, what's the exposure of the device to, potential malicious, because direct access is always, they can touch the chip. That's always the most difficult use case. But the question becomes, again, if it's a consumer device, yes, that's, if it's a pacemaker inside somebody's body, it's a little harder for someone to access it while you're alive. So that may or may not be such a threat vector. So it is pretty, there's so many variables that, yeah, we'd gladly sit down and have our, engineering team talk to someone about what is their specific deployment pattern and are the things if we haven't done them, we could do.
Okay. All right. So I understand it's something you consider and you provide as a service, basically. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
All right, Jay, I think we're in.
Yeah, Richard, I'll turn things back over to you. I think we're good on questions. We have a couple of follow-ups we'll send out for the group. Like I said, if you want to, I sent out an invitation for the ST webinar we're doing tomorrow, which will be more of a deep dive on the TQRND software-based jitter random number generation. If anybody wants to attend that, it's an ST webinar link I sent out earlier this morning on email.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much to Michael and Jay. What we'll do is we'll make sure that email goes out with the invitation to the ST Micro webinar. Hopefully that's enough detail on the Quantropi offer. And we'll take that into any email conversations or follow-up calls. And then I'll design something new for the next SIG group meeting. Thank you for Michael and Jay, Quantropi, and everybody that attended today. Thank you for your time.